Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 143. I'm feeling delighted about today's episode, not only because my guest has a fascinating story, but also because I felt such a connection during our conversation. Desmond Bovey has written a beautiful book, which is an exploration of a landscape in New Zealand that I've visited with my family and know a little about, so his work really spoke to me. Also, he's a Francophile and spent decades living in France. His story is about making a connection with the landscape and paying attention and putting pen to paper through nature art and writing. And all this came together in his book, which is called Tongariro National Park, an Artist's Field Guide. In our conversation, we talked about Desmond's beginnings, the adventures that led him to a life in France, and then the homecoming, which sparked this book, and the nature and landscapes and species and the moments that connected him again with the park and its inhabitants. Let's listen. Desmond, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to chatting to you today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to enjoy this myself.
So how about I tell the story about how I came to your work, which was that you have written this beautiful book, Tongariro National Park, an Artist's Field Guide. And my son's father received this book as a Christmas gift when we were holidaying in New Zealand. And straight away, as it was being unwrapped, I knew this was a book I was going to love. I looked through it and I knew I needed to speak to you. So that's how I came to your work, and it's going to be great to dive into the book and your work now.
Well, thank you very much. It's always good to get positive feedback like that. But I think the book, in a way, is a bit of a sketchbook. It's a bit of a journal, so I can see why it resonated for you.
Yes. So on this podcast, I really like to start to get to know my guests by going back in history and touching on their creative beginnings and their connection with nature, the beginnings of their connection with nature. And I'd love to hear a little about your childhood in nature. And I know that the national park was a bit of a backdrop to your childhood. I'd love to hear about your early connections with nature and the park.
Sure. I was one of a family of 7 children.
Wow.
And in those days, our parents weren't rich. We were just a kind of tribe in a way. And we ran free in a way. You know, we didn't even, our parents bought us shoes, but we didn't wear them, you know. And
yes.
in fact, our feet got so large, so flat, that it was actually torture to put on shoes. But we used to run around in the landscape, up and down the hills and all over the place, lifting up logs, puddling around in creeks. I think a lot of people identify with that. That's how I learned to love nature. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you spent a lot of your adult life overseas,
That's
in
right.
particular in France.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about this big adventure you had in France? How did you find yourself there?
It was, I never for a moment thought that I would end up in France. Just to backtrack a little bit, when I was in my very early 20s with 2 friends, we rode horses all around the South Island of New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
So we were on the road for a year and a half,
Wow.
trekking through the mountains. We did 2,000 kilometres. And that's a whole story in itself.
Yes, that's a book in itself.
Yes, it is. And those 2 guys are still my best friends.
Yeah.
But we're all much, much older now. But after that, I sort of continued my vagabond life. I spent a year and a half hitching around Australia.
Wow.
That was also an adventure, you know, on a different scale, you know, standing at intersections in the deserts waiting three days for a lift. It was the extremes of Australia, you know, was such a surprise to me. And the Australian landscapes, you know, the vastness of it. As a New Zealander, I found it very, very difficult to adapt I just thought there's nothing here.
Yeah,
Just
it's
nothing.
different.
And then you learn to look at the nothingness. And then you notice that the trees were kind of blue and shrubby were now orange. And then slowly they would evolve into something else and something else. And you ended up staring at these eucalyptus trees. And I learned to love the desert. So that was a formative time for me, you know. And of course, as a Kiwi, deeply jealous of Australian birds, you know. Like in another life, I would have loved to have done this book about an Australian landscape because of the beauty of the birds and the lizards and the snakes. But never mind, we have to make do with what we've got. And we love our birds. We love them to death. Yeah.
New Zealand birds are incredible.
Yeah. And I ended up, after that, I was still sort of vagabondish and footloose, so I ended up hitchhiking all around Europe. We drove also for a year and a half in America, up and down Canada to Guatemala in an old station wagon.
Wow.
And then I hitchhiked around Europe, and then I sort of fell in love with France, really. It just seemed to me... a culture. It was as if I had some French blood somewhere, which I don't. But I just fell in love with it and ended up in a university in France and studied for a year and a half. And then I became art director just by pure luck. And because I could draw, because my French was still not really that hot, but my drawing skills got me into that job. And I got a good job, actually, as an art director. And we formed our own agency in the end.
Okay.
For 15 years I was art director, and then I just, because more and more of my clients were environment, nature, and I sort of, you know how it is, you develop a network.
Yes.
I developed a network of people who trusted me and recommended me to each other. And so my last years in France, my last 5, 6, 7 years were just as a freelance nature illustrator. So 30 years there in France. And so that probably leads us to the next subject, which is what this book is about in a way, which is homecoming.
Yes, yes. Tell me about that. You say in the book, and this is a little quote that really drew me in, you said, I was hunting for a landscape to love, and I was looking for a way back in.
Yes.
And something about this just gives me goosebumps,
Yes.
because loving a landscape is something all my listeners will identify with. And that idea that you're coming home after 30 years of absence and there's people there, there's people to connect with, but the landscape needs to be loved as well. And I'd love to hear you talk about this homecoming and in particular, finding a landscape to love.
Yes, I think you've really put your finger on the key phrases in that book, you know, because I did when you live. When I lived in France, I really was away from it. I wasn't in Paris. It wasn't cosmopolitan. It was a provincial French city, Besançon, and I just didn't hear or speak English. I hadn't. So in a way, I got French citizenship. So I was a sort of a pretend Frenchman. But I lived in the world of France, and I had this huge knowledge about French politics, French culture, French actors, French birds, French animals and ecology. So when I threw all that in, it was no light thing. It was no small thing. I was already 60 or knocking 60. So when I came back to New Zealand, I just had this feeling of, what am I doing? You know, what have I done? What have I done?
What did make, if you don't mind me interrupting, what did make you make that big transition home?
Well, part of it was age. I was approaching retirement. You know, I still had a few years to go, but I just thought, do I want to be old in France or do I want to be old in New Zealand? And it seemed to me that New Zealand, after all, was a kinder society. Like I loved French society, I really loved it, but the French society is based on respect, and you have to sort of fight to get respect. Whereas I think in New Zealand and Australia, you're innocent until proven stupid, or whereas in France you have to prove that you should be liked, and it was more about respect. I got a little fatigued by that constant sort of tensions, that constant need to fight for respect. But when I came back, I had this brain full of French, and all this useless knowledge. So the need to reconnect and the fear that I might have made a huge mistake was in a way the genesis of this book. Yeah.
Yes. And so this park, Tongariro National Park, you've written this entire book, very detailed exploration of the park. I wonder if you can give a few phrases that will summarize the landscape. I know that's a big ask, but about the mountains there, about the landscapes, just to give a bit of a visual picture to the listener.
All right. Well, for people who don't know Tongariro, New Zealand, they will know vaguely the shape of the North Island. Let's imagine it. It's a kind of a diamond shape. And bang in the centre is this great mountain, or three mountains actually, and it's just really a huge pile of rocks that's been regurgitated up from a fault line, and the resulting landscapes are dramatic.
Yes.
There are glaciers getting smaller and smaller, but there are glaciers. There's a volcano that was used in Lord of the Rings films. It's a very, very complex geological landscape, but it's also a patchwork of habitats. But strange enough, but I think it's important that almost wherever you go in that part of New Zealand, you see these mountains on the skyline on a good day. So, from my hometown, Wanganui on the west coast, we would say to each other, "Did you see the mountain this morning?" Because sometimes it was so spectacular. So it was a kind of gravity, really, a kind of point that that made sense of the whole island, if you know what I mean. And of course, it had significance to the Maori people as well, of course. Yeah.
Yes, and these three mountains, there's a story that explains their creation, of course.
That's right. There's a creation myth. Yeah.
Yeah.
All about gigantic, titanic quarrels and jealousies and fights.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Amazing. Go on.
And you do feel it when you're there. Like they do seem to have this strange presence. And you can imagine them fighting away. Yeah.
Yes. So these three mountains, Ruapehu, Tongariro, and Narahoe, are a really significant part of that landscape. And as you say, they sort of anchor people. Have you seen the mountain? Have you seen what's going on there? It's a talking point. It's something to anchor the inhabitants.
And also there is that kind of latent menace.
Yes.
Because at any given moment they could just blow their tops.
Because it's a volcanic area.
They've done that before in Lake Taupo, which is in fact a huge crater of one of the world's biggest eruptions. So that shaped the landscape too. And maybe one day again will. I hope not too soon.
Have you been around while the volcano's been active?
No, there was some minor sort of minor eruptions that have taken place on Narahoe and Ruapehu, but I was in France during that time.
So let's go back to this idea of finding a way back in.
Yes.
And you say in the book, and I love this line also, this book began as a quick sketch on the back of an envelope. And I'd love for you to tell that story about the moment when you sat down and you sketched in the park and then things started opening up for you.
Yes. It was a strange moment. As I said, I arrived back in New Zealand in Auckland. The plane touched down and I thought, what have I done? And I hired a car and I drove straight south to Wanganui. And of course, when you drive to Wanganui, you have to drive across the volcanic plateau. And as I got closer, I just thought, will we see the mountain? Just when we were kids, will the mountain be visible? And it was absolutely splendid. It was a beautiful day. So on impulse, I turned left to Wakapapa in the Tongariro National Park, and I went for a walk. And as I was crossing this kind of upland of heath and boggy country with a zigzagging boardwalk, I looked up, and there on a track post was the New Zealand falcon, the karearea in Maori. Now, New Zealand doesn't have many raptors, not like Australia, So the falcon has a special place in our hearts, And it's also a very bold bird. It's a very unafraid bird. So in fact, it wasn't very far away. It was just sitting on this post like a totem in a way and looking at me. And something about the way it looked at me, something about its hooded eyes and its stillness seemed to be saying to me, what took you so long? And this sounds rather flaky and spiritual, but it was a moment that spoke to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I tried to get a photograph. I thought, wow, and of course I fumbled with my camera and my backpack. So I came away with no photograph. But when I got back to the car, I grabbed a biro, a ballpoint, and an old envelope and sketched it. It wasn't a very good sketch, but in a way it captured that moment, which was a critical moment for me because I thought, yes, I was right to come home. And that turned into an image. When I got back home, I worked on the image, and that is the cover image of that book.
I'm looking at it right now. This is also meaningful. And it was almost as if that bird was giving you an invitation.
Yes, I don't want to come across as too flaky, but
well, I'm all for it.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's more about me than the bird,
Yeah.
But I was ready for a message. But also, we all through myth, birds have been messengers.
Yes.
We think of Noah and the Ark, and the hundreds of other examples of different myths. So that was my own personal mythology.
Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned photography, because I think in some ways that photography can, I just remember going on a whale watching tour, and I was trying to get an amazing photograph, and I was with my camera and I was taking a photo, but I felt like I was missing it.
Yes.
I was missing the experience.
Yes,
and so I put my camera away and I just experienced it. And you were talking about fumbling with the camera, and I'm wondering about your feeling between having a camera between you and nature or having a sketch pad, and the difference between those two experiences.
I really understand what you're saying about the whale and how photography just gets in the way, in a way. I had a friend who was a mountaineer, and we climbed these peaks, but he refused to take a camera. He said, if I take a photograph, all I remember later is the photograph. And he said, what I want to remember is the sensation that I felt there,
Yeah.
And also perhaps accepting that everything is in its way temporary and must pass. But to get back to your question, I think that there's a place for photography and there's a place for illustration. I think, I love them both. But my particular way is I'm a drawer. I'm a compulsive drawer. I can't stop drawing. And that's how this book in a way began, because I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to start drawing a book. I just drew and drew, and this pile of papers and notebooks kept getting fatter and fatter. And in the end I said, is this a book? And if so, what kind of book? And I didn't really know right to the end. And then the editor said, we're going to call it an artist's field guide because it implied a certain subjectivity. It was my take on Tongariro National Park. I'm not pretending to be a scientist or to have written the definitive book on flora and fauna. And I also hope to capture a little bit of atmosphere, a little bit of... what I really wanted was that the person reading the book would feel that they were with me, walking beside me. And I was very pleased when two of the reviews, the best reviews, said exactly that they had the impression that they were out walking with me, looking over my shoulder. And I'm so glad that I avoided that top-down textbook tone. I've got all the information. I know everything. I don't. And there's nothing. I think one of the most wonderful things is just walking in nature with someone who's intelligent and curious, and just swapping, speculating.
Yes, absolutely, that comes across. And I'm glad you mentioned curiosity, because nature journalists as a species are inherently curious. We talk about intentional curiosity a lot, like going outside with the intention to see what's out there, because there is infinite wonders out there, even in local backyard. I mean, Tongariro is a spectacular part of the world, but there is curiosities everywhere. And when we go outside with this mindset of being curious intentionally, we see all the things we might miss. So I'm interested to hear your relationship with curiosity in nature.
I think that curiosity for me is a key word. Really, really important. In fact, to be honest, if I meet someone who's not curious, who's incurious, I just lose interest in them immediately. I mean, curiosity is a sign of a lively intelligence. That's what you want from people. And those people who don't have that curiosity scare me in a way. and they don't have wonder, because wonder and curiosity, when we're talking about nature anyway, are very overlap. They're very much the same thing.
Yes.
But also, I agree with what you said. It can be very, very small things. It can be backyard things. It can be a few sparrows under the clothesline, or it can be. You've got to learn to look. This is another big theme of my book is observation. You can't draw if you haven't looked, and it's amazing how many people are not very good at looking. They're not very good at listening. It's a skill that you
can get better at, I think.
Yes, it's something that you have to cultivate. Yeah. And all drawers know that. First of all, you have to look, and you have to. That should be obvious. It's not always so.
Yes, I agree. I'm interested in your process. You talked about just going out and sketching and then realizing, hey, these sketchbooks are piling up and this could be something more. I'm wondering about how you did it. At what point you started going out with intention to write this chapter or that chapter of the book, or did you quite literally just gather your sketchbooks and then organize it together? What was your process for putting the book together?
It was a pretty messy process because by then I was retired. Yeah. So I was just, as I said, I'm a compulsive drawer. I draw every day. And I draw what I see. And I learned as I went along. But the point where, A, this is going to be a book, and B, how to organize that book, and C, how to go about getting it published, those were sort of messy, they weren't well-defined moments. It's as if the drawing was what it was all about.
Yes.
And I didn't actually sit down and dream of having a book that would be as successful as this one has been, actually. I think it's been very lucky. That came later.
Do you have your sketching kit in your bag, in your pocket at all times?
Well, I'm ashamed to say that, I'm not well kitted out. I usually have a notebook sometimes, to be really honest. I just have a few pages. I systematically, when I'm out for a walk, particularly in a new landscape, I'll note all the plants that I see and all the birds, So I've got these lists. And if I don't recognize the plants, which is quite often the case because alpine plants are quite, they're quite specific, I'll do sketches and maybe take a few photos with my phone and go back home and then swat them up. But if you know the book, you'll know that it's really just a whole series of 2-page spreads, and on almost every spread is a big landscape that covers 2 pages. So that one I would always sort of sketch out in the field in pencil.
Yeah.
And sometimes, not very often, I think, that's not such a bad sketch after all. So I just add a bit of colour, and a few of those got into the book. I didn't have to redo them. Because I think the faster you draw, and I've always been a very fast drawer, the more spontaneity it's got. Illustrators talk about overcooking.
Yes. Yes.
And I get so angry with myself when I just go a little bit too far and I lose spontaneity. And, like you're aiming ideally for a kind of freshness in your drawing.
And I find myself drawn to that. You know, there's some amazing skilled artists who can reproduce plants in this perfect botanical art sort of way. And yet I'm drawn to the ones, my heart are drawn to the ones that are sketchy and spontaneous and wonky and have their own flavour.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And to get back to what you were saying, you know, like if you, in a way, that sounds really corny, but in a way, everything is beautiful. Everything is drawable.
Yes.
In my book, I drew a few of those kind of crazy signs you find beside the railway line, you know, because I just thought they were so graphic and weird, you know, all these symbols and that. And they were part of the park landscape too, you know, the railway line goes through the park.
Yes.
So, yeah, how to draw and what to draw. Yeah.
I'm really interested in this idea of people in the landscape, because those signs, you know, there's human inhabitants and how they interact, and it might be local people, it might be hikers, it might be whoever it is. I'm wondering about what you noticed about the human interaction with the landscape in the park.
Well, it was interesting because I was doing flora and fauna with a little bit of geology. I wasn't interested in people, but so you can't avoid them.
Yes.
Hikers are everywhere. So when, you know, it became inevitable that there was going to be a hiker or a tourist in the landscape, which I tried to avoid, I would just sketch them in pencil, and make them as if they were kind of ghosts. I had to admit that people frequent it, you know, like the Tongariro crossing. It's like the main street of a town sometimes.
It's a hiking
so
highway.
I can't pretend that they're not there, but I phased them out a little bit. And when I had to sit down and draw all the introduced predators, I thought, well, what's the worst introduced predator? What's the one that's done the most damage? So I drew a man with an axe. So there's another human being. But I think if I did another book, I would actually like to draw more people. I like drawing people. Yeah. People are so fascinating. Yeah.
They are fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated. I mean, I started this podcast to talk about stories of people interacting with nature. I find that really fascinating, and the things that go on inside a person when they commit to a landscape like you have. I think that's a really fascinating interaction. And that you mentioned invasive species, and that's a whole nother story, because New Zealand is a very sensitive landscape, and there's these introduced plants and animals that are there. And the fact is that European settlers deliberately, as they did in Australia, in New Zealand, deliberately introduced species because of nostalgia for home. And this is part of the book. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, actually, you know, amongst the more learned journals, often introduced species get overlooked or treated rather dismissively, you know. But in fact, I love a lot of the introduced birds. I think there's nothing more beautiful than a goldfinch. Do you have goldfinches in?
I haven't seen one, but maybe.
But we have cockatoo.
Right, okay.
And we have rosellas that are everywhere now.
I knew that rosellas
the Eastern rosella, and you can't get a more beautiful bird than that. And I just love to see them flashing through the landscape, and chaffinches, but most of the birds are not very dangerous. It's the mammals, stoats, ferrets, possums, rats. They are the big killers. They're the baddies. Yeah.
It's interesting. When I was young, my first backpacking trip was in New Zealand. I was alone, and I travelled down the country for 6 months. And every time someone heard that I was Australian, I was blamed for the possum problem in New Zealand.
You weren't blamed. We weren't looking for them. We wanted the fur. We thought it would be great.
So they were introduced for fur.
Yes, and spread around the country really very quickly by repeated introductions. Yeah. And the same with wallabies now. Wallabies are the big villains, you know, because they're actually exploding, eating out the landscape, you know. So there's war on wallabies now, which is kind of weird because they're so cute, you know. You think, oh, how can we kill a wallaby? But we do have to, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's an interesting thing. And then New Zealanders come to Australia and they have this internal. I mean, we have a terrible problem with introduced cane toads here in Queensland.
Cane toads, yes,
everywhere, and I have this internal physical hatred of cane toads. They didn't do anything wrong. They were deliberately introduced to counteract the cane beetle, which oddly does not inhabit the same physical space as them, so that was a total disaster. But I have this visceral reaction to cane toads, and I've seen New Zealanders have the same reaction to cute little possums in Brisbane, you know. It's a physical reaction.
One of the propositions was to do some genetic engineering so that possums would become infertile.
Okay.
But we can't do that because our Australian neighbours will not let it. They do not. They're scared that it might jump the Tasman. These things do.
Yes.
While they're not welcome here, possums are very much a part of the ecology of Australia. It's
interesting, isn't it? These experiments that you don't really know the outcome. We've seen some devastating effects of experimenting on nature like in that way.
Well, I talk about the European heather in my book a lot. That was nostalgia. You know, people sort of almost top-dressed heather seed all through Tongariro, thinking they could recreate Scotland. And of course it just proliferated and squeezed out all kinds of native species. It's just meddling, constant meddling, and it's often not, it's just not thought through, you know.
That's exactly right. It's not, the consequences couldn't have been predicted, I guess, back then because people didn't have the scientific knowledge or...
No, we've got to remember that, yeah.
Speaking of heather, I would love to hear you speak about the uniqueness of the colours of the park. And heather, when it's in bloom, obviously colours the landscape. But apart from that, you mention the colours of the natural landscape and the palette, and I would love to hear you speak about colour because to me it's something very important for connecting with a landscape, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I found after a while that I was only using 4 or 5 colours actually, mostly.
What were your colours, can I ask?
My colours were natural sepia. I never, like most artists, I never touch black. But I used natural sepia as a kind of toning aid. And if I mix it with Naples yellow, which is the colour of tussock here, you get a nice sort of muddy, earthy tone, which is very, very much part of the landscape in Tongariro. So natural sepia, Naples yellow. For green, I used sap green. Although greens, most artists will know, are quite difficult, you know. And olive, a lot of olive. You know, a lot of the plants are quite dull, you know, and heathy and sort of... there are not many bright colours. Only the occasional blue bright lake, green or turquoise. And then, of course, all the bright colours are introduced.
That's
Broom,
interesting.
A yellow flowering plant, and heather, purple. And, of course, hikers. You know, they've got these bright beanies and their packs and their jackets.
There's a unique look to the hikers in New Zealand. I remember when I was 18, I went there. I did a lot of hiking in Fiordland National Park, and the stripy leggings with the shorts over the top. This was a unique, to me, unique thing. And I remember laughing to myself about this look, and then by the end of it I was doing the same. I was doing the same thing. It's so practical.
I suppose if you're looking for fashion icons, you shouldn't go to the backcountry huts of Fiordland.
But I agree, and I wonder if looking at colour is a go-to for you for connecting with the landscape when you were going back in. And we've done a little bit of travelling in France last year, and as we flew in, I remember seeing like that patchwork of countryside and the way that the colours were adjacent and in this amazing way. But I find personally that colour says so much to you about a particular place? And I've noticed it when we've travelled in New Zealand as well, because we go there every year to see my son's paternal family. There's something that, again, as we're talking about a way to connect, I find colour to be that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think for people like you and me, colour, I think, just to broaden the subject a little, I think that if you're an illustrator or a drawer like myself, in a way, you have to privilege your senses. And
Yes.
I've always had very strong eyes,
Interesting.
and useless ears. I'm hopeless in music, Like I had a friend tried to teach me a guitar. He almost threw away the guitar into disgust, because I had no ear. I still have no ear. And I just think that from a very, very young age, I favoured my sight, and colour is, of course, important to me. Very important, actually. It can sometimes feel quite painful when you see colours put together wrongly. Sometimes it works, of course.
Yes.
But France, in a way, it's hard to talk about colour in France. You have to be more regional.
Okay,
And
yes.
I lived in the east of France, which was the Jura Mountains. So there was a lot of limestone there, so we had these white cliffs. And of course you've got much more seasonal variation, you'd get a dark green forest that would suddenly turn all shades of russet and ochre and orange. And in summer you got these fields of rape. I don't know,
Canola, we call it.
Yeah, and they're just so vivid and beautiful, and that
Yes.
patchwork effect of them, maybe that's what you saw from the plane.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm thinking now of France, and we spent some time in Marseille and went to Les Calanques.
Yeah, that's also limestone too. Yeah.
Yes, beautiful white and juxtaposed with the deep blue of the sky, and then this crystal clear water that was just beyond words.
Yes.
Yeah,
France is incredibly beautiful.
Yeah.
And very, very rich. Yeah. But Australia, talking about colours, Australia, all those reds.
Yes.
And as you travel along, like be hitchhiking, and sometimes I sit on the back of a truck, and I just lie there looking at the landscapes and say, oh, look how red the soil is here, and then after a while it wasn't the same red. So Australia has its own powerful colours. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I live on the east coast, just outside of Brisbane, and we are a subtropical area, but we have lots of forests that are classified as dry sclerophyll forest, and they have their own unique, dusty greens. It's almost olive, but it's its own colour, almost grey, almost green. And
eucalyptus.
Yeah, the eucalyptus leaves, and I spend a lot of time musing on this. And even in summertime, our landscape just gets very yellow from being dry. And that it's not yellow, but it's not cream. It's like this unique colour. And I've had Kiwi friends and family come over and say, oh, everything's so dry. And, talking about this colour without appreciation. And for me, this is the colour of my landscape, and this is the colour that speaks to my heart, and it's something that connects me with my place, and I just think that's such a beautiful thing.
I think that Kiwis have a very sort of chocolate box idea of beauty. I did. When I was a young man and went to Australia, I thought, well, where is it?
This isn't quite it. Yeah.
But in fact, you have to learn. You just have to learn, and then suddenly, boom, you see it.
Yes.
This vast sky, and it's just... so, looking... It goes back to what we were saying. Looking is an apprenticeship.
Yes.
And it's a never-ending apprenticeship in a way, Yes.
That is beautiful. That's a beautiful way to say it. Looking is an apprenticeship. And I remember, again, when I was on my first backpacking trip, I flew into Auckland, and I remember it so clearly. I flew over those fields, the farms, and I remember seeing a green I'd never seen before.
It's true. Maybe in Tasmania a little bit, I'm not sure.
Yeah. It was so green in a way that my eyes had never seen, but that made such an impression.
But even coming from France, I looked out the window and I thought, it's like a postcard. All the colours are too vivid, you know. Can they tone it down a bit? Yeah. Even sort of suburban gardens were all sort of quite violently coloured, you know. And that's what I think I liked about Tongariro National Park when I was driving down. I thought of its colours as authentic. I just like those olives and greys and the colours of lichen and scree and rock and scrub, tussock. Yeah.
Let's talk about little details, because in your book there's a lot of exploration into the tiny worlds of moss and other small things. And I think of you down there on your knees, maybe searching and looking at the details. And this in itself is its own apprenticeship. I think that noticing the little things, the feeling and the texture of bark or moss and what's going on in these tiny worlds. Tell me about that.
That's true. There are up if you get up to fairly high altitude, there are tarns, which are sort of small mountain lakes. Really, some are only as big as a pond, but they have their own little ecology. And if you look, if you get down on your hands and knees and look, it's a funny little world. It's like a little world on another planet, because you've got this strange. Often it's very rich in iron. So you get a kind of yellow, a kind of orange mouldy growth that's not very attractive. But you know, there's a little world. It's like looking, and I remember looking, because I did a lot of horse riding, I remember looking into my horse's eye once, really, really deeply. You know, and it was like looking on another planet, you know. And I got the same feeling here, you know, looking into these little pools. But there is a lot, if you stop looking at the big stuff. Very small orchids growing on you could easily overlook them, but they're in their way. They're very beautiful, you know, and insects, of course. And I write a lot in my book about, you know, the mountains when they're behind cloud. We look at the foreground. And then we realise that, you know, we've been so busy looking at these magnificent peaks.
It's interesting.
That we overlooked the foreground. And the foreground, it was very, very interesting. I wrote a lot about the foreground. But there was a haiku, I can't remember it exactly, that said something to the effect of, clouds come from time to time to rest us from looking at the moon, something like that.
That's amazing, yeah. Interesting. And some of the book is an exploration into specific species, different species, and I'm wondering, because there's so many different things to look at, how did you choose who to showcase in the book? How did you choose who to learn about? And I also love that you did focus on like the less assuming things. You know, there's the big things, but also there's the little guys. And I'm wondering how you chose which species to include in the book.
Well, it goes back to what I said. I was just learning as I went along.
Yeah.
If for example, I was walking amongst some what we call podocarps, and the emergent trees in the New Zealand forest, the biggest trees, and if at that moment a kaka, a parrot, the native parrot, flew past, I would draw the parrot. I would draw the kaka because it was part of my experience. And if a cuckoo flew past, or if I heard one, I'd put it in my double-page spread. Or if I saw these little carnivorous plants, these insectivores, I'd put them in. So I just really put it in what I saw. But, you know, sometimes it's a very small thing. There's not much going on, you know, above a certain altitude. You'll see a few grasshoppers and they're flicking about. But I remember seeing this little moth, a day-flying moth, and its wings were grey. You couldn't see it when it was on a rock, but when it flew, it had orange underwings.
Oh, wow.
It was only a small thing, but I thought, I'll draw that, or, you know, I'll try and grab a photo of that. Well, I was chasing it around, and it kept disappearing every time it settled. And these tourists came over to me, and they wanted to know what I was hunting for, you know. And I tried to explain that, you know. I was doing there was a moth, you know, and they looked at me with frank disbelief.
What are you doing?
Pity. Yeah.
I love that, because your page becomes the story of your experience in that moment.
Yeah, I hope so.
Tell me about the writing, because I found the writing really poetic and literary and evocative of the landscape. And I wonder if you had a writing practice before this, or if this was something you came to when the project started. What's your writing process?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for saying that, because I sort of know roughly what I'm worth with my illustration, but writing has always, writing has been my second love. I just love writing. I love reading. I read every night. But writing is hard. I don't believe anyone who says that writing is easy. It's hard.
Yeah.
And I sweated over it. But any compliment to my writing, and I've had some, it just goes straight to my head. I just feel drunk. Because I worked so hard.
Yes, yes.
And the thing about writing is connect. What the person reading it has to have in some way felt what you're feeling. Yes. And they have to say, oh, yes, that's So, and the other thing about, writing, my love of writing, I have had a few short stories published, but because I was away from the New Zealand scene for so long, I dropped out of ever dreaming of getting published as a writer. But that double skill, and it meant that, I always worried that I was never going to be really good in one or the other, like I was spreading myself too thin, because I'd draw for a while, obsessively, and then I'd go through a stage of writing. Yes. But it comes together in your field, writing and
that's exactly
drawing.
Right.
And that's where I feel quite at home. I quite like that.
In nature journaling, we think of it like almost like layering, or I think of it like this, you have your observations of nature and you can put them down in different ways. And we use words and pictures. We also use numbers sometimes. And each of these ways of expressing yourself on paper helps you build a more rounded picture of nature or of your experiences. And so that's why I think your observations of nature through illustration are just enriched by the writing, because it's another way of expressing your experience, and you do that so beautifully.
I've been lucky that I've been able to do that. If the editor had said, we're going to get someone else to do the writing, I wouldn't have done it.
Sure. Yes.
And in fact, because I'm such a control freak, and he said so. I said. He said, I realised quite quickly that I was dealing with a control freak. So, in fact, I did all the graphics myself. I did. Okay. Yeah. Well, and he let me go, I said to him, well, how many pages do you think? And he said, look, it's your book. Just do what you feel is right. And I think I was very, very lucky,
Yes. It might have played differently if you'd had a different person guiding
you. Because I was a freelance illustrator for so long, and I knew that I had to do what my client wanted. I was there for my client. I was being paid to please my client, not to please myself. But when I stopped being, and when I did a project for myself, I wanted it to be for myself.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So I have a group of listeners that support the podcast on Patreon, and part of being a member of Patreon is that I put my guests up there ahead of time, or who I'm going to interview, and then listeners are able to ask questions. And a listener, Jackie, has a question for you, which is also about writing. And Jackie says, I'm sure that you could write pages and pages for each part of the book, each entry, and they want to know, how do you decide what to describe, and how do you decide on the length of your description? Similar to, how do you sketch or paint something? Do you write stream of consciousness? Do you write dot points? How does the actual process of writing about something unfold?
I would say that I try not to overthink when I start. Yeah. Sometimes it just comes on its own. Sometimes I don't want myself to intrude too much. And at the same time, I don't want to sound too scientific or... so it's finding a midway between the two. It helps that generally I've got a fairly on most pages I've got a fairly clear idea of how many words I'm allowed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And there's 3 different levels of reading in those double pages. I've got a heading with an introduction, and the text, which is, I don't know, maybe 200 to 300 words. And then I've got floating captions, so I can say a lot in the captions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the captions are read. People may not read the text. A lot of people just look at the pictures. So I'm quite happy with that. But so I have those 3 different levels of reading. Otherwise, I can hardly answer the question, really, because I don't overanalyze.
Yes.
And when I've written something, I like to let it set for a little while and then come back, and I see obvious faults, so it's a matter of tweaking. And I do tweak a lot. Good writing is in revision.
Yes. Yes. Isn't it interesting when someone asks you about your creative process? Sometimes it's hard to pull apart what, if someone asks in particular, because I do a lot of watercolor painting, and there's so much like water control and different things that you do instinctively after many years that it's hard to pull apart what you actually do. Mm-hmm.
And there's that old thing about, if you pull all petals off the rose to see what a rose, you don't have a rose.
Yeah.
So maybe some things are better left unanalyzed, It's a mysterious process.
It is. Yeah. I love hearing you talk about that. When you went out in the park, did you go on foot? Did you go in a car? How did you explore the area? Were you hiking? What was the process?
Well, we always drove to the park because it was about an hour and a quarter from Wanganui, So, and thereafter we parked and walked. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My partner loves running, so he did running, and he'd run for 10, 15 Ks, and then we'd join up at an agreed point, which meant that I had that time alone.
Yes.
Which is good, because if someone else is with you, you worry about boring them. Think, oh, look at this, oh, look, here's another little bit thing. But by that time, we were okay. We could continue,
together. Yeah,
it was teamwork.
It's so lovely that he was involved in that, and that you had found a way to be side by side and yet not.
It really worked. It worked perfectly, because I'd have my hour and a half by myself in the forest. I love that. Just love it. And he had his running, so he had his endorphins or whatever he gets from running. And I got my sort of forest healing, whatever that is. And by that time, we were always in such good moods, that we just tramped on happily.
Yes. This is a thing for nature journalists. In fact, I've talked to a lot of people about this, the finding your way through, being out in the forest with someone else. And do you make them sit with you? Do they do it as well? Do they go on the hike or whatever it is? I love that you have found with your partner.
We've worked out a really good system. I don't know if you can. I think it's a solitary thing. Drawing is a solitary thing, and it's an introspective thing. You might find that mushroom just absolutely fascinating and wonderful, and spend a quarter of an hour drawing it, but the person standing beside you is thinking, oh, I'm hungry.
I'm ready to go.
A hamburger or something.
So this landscape is absolutely shaped, as we said, by volcanic activity, and just you touched on that you were documenting the life here, but the life is also informed and held by the geology of the landscape. And I'm interested in your take on the connection with the geological history of this place.
Yes, interesting. The park is geology. It's nothing else. It's and the biggest factor is possibly altitude.
Yes.
Because as you get higher and higher and higher, you see all the different stages of vegetation and life forms. So of course you can't ignore it. I deliberately did not go too much into volcanology. I got a kind of obsession about the lava flows on Narahoe, and spent about a whole week obsessing about which one happened when and why, and wondering why the hell I cared, and thinking, well, no one else is going to care. But sometimes you have to follow these little obsessions.
Yes.
But I just felt that it was outside my area of expertise. I ended up drawing the rocks, and I loved drawing the rocks. I never thought that I would enjoy, and they stay still. They
Yes,
don't move
that's
around.
a handy
That's a big
benefit.
help.
Yeah, I like that you said that the park is the geology and the plants and animals are interacting with that because the plants are fed on the soil that was created from this history, and the animals are sunbathing on the rocks and whatever else. Yeah. What did you take with you when you were outside? It sounds like you did some sketching in the field and some sketching at home, and I'd love to know what you had with you. Do you take colours with you, or is it mostly pen and pencil?
I don't take colour. I'm just not organised enough. And I think if I took colour, I'd have to take a seat.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
And then it's all starting to sound a little bit too organised for me because sometimes, living so close to the mountains, we could go up there on a spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment decision. And we'd just grab a big bottle of water and maybe buy a couple of sandwiches at the service station and be off. So colour drawing directly in the field I didn't do very much at all.
So is it pencil you were using?
I'd use a pencil, and then I'd sort of write in the notes olive or red highlights or and strangely enough, often the image that I would compose in pencil was very, very close to the original. I didn't often deviate. I might have shuffled a tree out of the way, or maybe a branch out of the way, and I'd put a bird in. But mostly I was fairly faithful to that.
Yes. It's lovely to have that. And again, as what we were talking about, how sometimes photography can make you remember the photograph. I feel that sketching, you in your studio or wherever you paint later on, that looking at that sketch can take you back. It can drop you into that moment that you were.
Oh yeah, and there were special moments, special moments that you looked up and here was a great big kaka with the sun on it, and it was all red, and the falcon, but also lots of other really happy encounters.
Yeah. You talk in the book about touching a feeling of what you describe as calm wonder. And this really speaks to me because that is the very reason why I started nature journaling, to have a moment of stillness with nature. And I'd love to hear you articulate what that means to you and where and how you are most likely to drop into that moment of calm wonder.
Well, you've just described it very well. Does it happen to everybody? I suppose. I don't know. Or perhaps we're just the kind of people that really need nature. And for me, it's often associated with birds. If I'm feeling a little down, I remember once in France, the first couple of years were quite tough. And I was in winters. The winters were so cold, I couldn't believe it, But I was walking along in a forest and it was so steely and bare, and on the track was kind of muddy, but there was a puddle in front of me and there were two goldfinches bathing in this puddle, and it was just so beautiful. And I just felt uplifted. Yeah. And I thought, for once I'm in the right moment, in the right mood, at the right time. It doesn't happen all that often.
Yes.
So I just go with it now. I just love it when it happens. Yeah.
It's a powerful feeling, isn't it? And I always reflect on one of the first times I felt that when I was very young, maybe 8 or 9, and it just moved me so much, and I felt just completely connected with everything that was around me in that moment, and just that realization that you are a human being, which is we are animals, and we're part of this landscape as much as we like to pretend that we're not.
Very important. Was this in the forest, or was it in...
It was actually in a property that was adjacent to my school, and I wasn't supposed to be there, but I wandered up the driveway and I sat in this little ray of sunshine underneath some pine trees, and so the smell of pine just was completely redolent, and I was just there with the sun and the pine smell, and I just realized something, like we're part of this.
Yes.
And we have our senses. We have been given this, for whatever reason, we've been given this opportunity to be here and to experience the world with our senses and with our heart. And then again, you know, you were saying like you didn't want to be too woo-woo about it. But for me, that experience is indescribable and something to be totally grateful for.
Yes.
And when it comes, it's just the best.
When it comes, enjoy it.
Yeah.
But perhaps you can cultivate it to a certain extent too.
I think so.
But I think that you put your finger on it when you said that part of it is belonging to nature, being part of nature. You have to get away from the static of civilization, the noise of traffic, the babble of radio and TV and even social media. Excuse me.
Yes. It's distraction.
I know exactly what you mean. And I think that it's about recognizing it when it happens and perhaps cultivating it.
Yes. In nature journaling circles, we often talk about the ability to fall in love with nature and how paying attention and being curious and being with part of nature helps us fall in love. Yeah, so falling in love with nature as an experience, you know?
Yes.
Did you feel after writing this book that you had a deeper love for the park?
I probably felt during the writing the book, I felt it. After, it has a kind of virality. You sit there and you scribble away, you know, and you're in your own little world, and it's yours.
Yes.
But when the book comes out, you think, gosh, it's a book. You know, I've done a book.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh, my poor thing, it's like having a child. You know, my God, it's got to go out into the world.
It's out in the world. Yes.
It's going to be misunderstood. People are not going to like it. People are going to mistreat it. But in fact, of course, it's had a lovely reaction. But I don't have the same feeling for it anymore. You know, I feel a kind of pride. But I don't feel involved in it anymore.
That's interesting. Do you have another project to focus your attention on?
Well, I said that I wasn't going to do anything for a while. I've been writing about the horse trek that I told you about, you know, that sort of coming of age story. But that I'm just playing around and I can feel the urge to draw again, you know, like I'm enjoying the words. But I don't know whether I would embark on such a long project because this was 2 to 3 years, you know. Not sure if I have those 2 to 3 years now. Yeah.
You could just play and see where it leads you. And even exploring old memories can be such a joy in itself.
Yeah. And you know, like I could do nature journaling. I have done nature journaling, you know. And I did a lot of traveling in Africa. And my African friends, when they finally trusted me, took me to all kinds of ceremonies and kind of mystic, you know. But I was looking at my illustrated journals from that period. They're very, very evocative. You know, it's such a nice way to record memories.
Absolutely. You've had some amazing adventures. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and opening this little window into the park and your experience of nature there. Thank you so much, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Beth, and it's been a pleasure to talk.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Desmond. I just love this gentle musing on nature and art and what it is to make a connection with the landscape. I think this idea that nature can bring us home is really powerful. When we connect with a landscape, we have a strong sense of place, and it can be an anchor in our lives. I'd love for you to visit the show notes for this episode, where you'll find a link to Potton and Burton, who published Tongariro National Park, an Artist's Field Guide. You can purchase the book from them if you like. I highly recommend it if you know the park or would like to be taken there through the pages of Desmond's sketchbook. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.